Okay, so you know when you sent in those geography notes on settlements? I gotta say, I was pretty psyched.
Oh, yeah. What about it grabbed you?
Well, it seems kind of simple at first, right? Settlements. But then you really get into it, and it's like this whole thing, like how we interact with the planet. You've got these tiny villages that haven't changed in forever, and then these huge cities packed with people. Super interesting.
I see what you mean. And speaking of megacities, you mentioned Johannesburg in your notes. Did you know it was one of the fastest growing cities in the world during the gold rush?
Really? Wow. Can you imagine going from some quiet village to all that craziness practically overnight?
It's a pretty stark contrast for sure.
So, okay, let's break this down. Your notes defined a settlement as basically any place where people live.
Right. But it's not just about plunking down some houses. It's more like think about how people use the land, how they build a community in their environment.
Yeah, it's like this whole interaction between what people need and the space they're in.
You got it. That's
Oh.
what makes settlements so fascinating.
And that's where we get into the two main types, rural and urban.
Exactly. You outlined the differences in your notes. Life in rural settlements revolves around the land, farming, fishing, forestry,
Hmm.
even things like small-scale mining.
Right, they're totally tied to the natural world.
Exactly. Urban areas are completely different. Instead of relying directly on the land, urban areas are all about industry, commerce, and services.
Manufacturing, finance, healthcare, education,
Yeah.
all that stuff. It's all concentrated in cities.
Precise.
It makes sense though, right? You need a certain number of people to make all those jobs and industries work.
Absolutely. You need that critical mass.
But it's interesting to think about how that changes how cities are designed. Like, my notes mention that urban areas are divided into zones, each with a specific purpose.
You're right. It's about organization and efficiency.
No.
Think of it like, well, you wouldn't just throw your socks in with your forks in a drawer.
Yeah, oh, that's a visual.
Everything has its place. And it's the same in a city. You've got industrial zones for manufacturing, commercial zones for businesses and shops, residential areas for people to live, and so on.
So, using that analogy, what's like the silverware of a city? The prime real estate?
Ah, you're talking about the Central Business District, often called the CBD.
The CBD? Yeah, okay, that sounds familiar. Like the main hub, right? Lots of action, businesses, shops, skyscrapers, even.
You got it. Your notes mention busy streets, shops and offices, and transport hubs. It's where most of the city's economic activity is concentrated.
That makes sense. But you mentioned residential areas earlier. People don't just live in the CBD, right?
Right. The CBD might be the heart of the city for business, but residential areas are where people actually live. And just like cities, residential areas come in different shapes and sizes.
And this is where it gets interesting. Because the notes talk about different types of housing, high, middle, and low income. What does that even mean when we're talking about a city? It's not like they're putting price tags on houses. It's definitely more complicated than that. These income levels usually show up in the kind of housing and the things you find in a certain area. High income areas might have bigger houses, more green spaces, private security. Think like gated communities or those fancy apartment buildings.
Location, 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 as they say.
Yeah.
But it's also about what comes with that location,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Then you have your middle income areas, which might have smaller houses, townhouses, or apartments. They usually have decent schools and public transportation. And finally, there are low income areas. These areas often don't have enough decent housing or good infrastructure and services. Think informal settlements or older parts of the city that haven't seen a lot of investment.
Makes sense. But hold on a second. The notes also mention light and heavy industry, which sounds like we're moving away from where people live. You're right. We're switching gears a bit to how cities actually function. Remember how we talked about organization? Just like you don't want a smelly cheese factory right next to your bedroom, cities separate different types of industries.
Yeah, I doubt a giant oil refinery is anyone's dream neighbor.
For sure. Heavy industries like manufacturing, refining, or large-scale production are usually put in special industrial zones. They're often kept separate from residential areas to minimize the impact on people's quality of life and their health.
So it's about safety and efficiency, but also about things like minimizing pollution.
Exactly. And then there's light industry, which tends to be smaller scale and have a smaller impact. Things like making clothes, processing food, or putting together electronics. These industries might be located closer to residential areas or even within those commercial zones we were talking about.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get the bigger picture. But there's still something missing, isn't there? It can't just be all work and no play. What about things like leisure activities, shopping, entertainment?
You're talking about the social side of a city, and you're totally right. It's not all about industry and where people live. That's where things like shopping centers, places to go out, parks, and recreational facilities become important.
Like they sprinkle in a little fun with all the practical stuff.
You got it. Shopping centers in particular are interesting. They usually bring together a bunch of different stores, restaurants, and services in a convenient spot. They're usually easy to get to from those residential areas.
Kind of like a mini CBD, but maybe with less hustle and more, well, shopping.
That's a perfect way to put it. And we can't forget green spaces, parks, gardens, nature reserves. They're a great way to escape the city and enjoy some nature, and they make the city a better place to live overall.
It's all starting to click. It's like all these different zones, each with their own purpose, all working together to make this complex thing we call a city.
Exactly. But remember, cities aren't static. They're always changing, evolving, and adapting to new challenges and opportunities.
And speaking of challenges, my notes mention a word that always comes up when you talk about cities, urbanization. And something tells me it's not always easy or pretty. Okay, so we've talked about how cities are organized, the different zones, the whole convenience factor. But my notes bring up urbanization, and it feels like we're shifting from, I don't know, a nice organized drawer to a washing machine on spin cycle.
That's a pretty good analogy. Urbanization can definitely feel like this unstoppable force, kind of chaotic.
You know, it's interesting. Your notes are all about Africa, and there's a reason for that. Did you know that Africa is seeing the highest rates of urbanization in the world right now?
Really? I knew there were a lot of growing cities, but wow, why is that? Is it that cities are just way more appealing than rural areas? What's going on?
It's definitely more complicated than that. Remember how we talked about the different ways people interact with the land in rural areas versus cities? Imagine being a farmer facing years of drought. Your crops fail, you can't find work, and you can't support your family. That's gotta be a big reason to leave, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. When everything depends on the land and it doesn't support you anymore, it makes sense to look for something better, right? And then imagine hearing about this city with job opportunities, better schools for your kids, maybe even a chance to be closer to family who already moved there. Those are some pretty strong pulls towards cities.
Push and pull factors. It's like this magnet drawing people in from the countryside. But then there's the question of, can cities even handle that much growth? My notes mentioned apartheid and how it impacted South African cities. Something tells me it wasn't easy.
You're right about that. The legacy of policies like that 1913 Land Act, the one that basically stopped black South Africans from owning land in most areas, and then, of course, the apartheid regime, enforcing racial segregation, they've had a lasting effect on South African cities even today.
So it wasn't just people going to cities for opportunity, but they were also being forced into certain areas because of their race. Sadly, yes. And the impact of those policies is still here today. We see it in things like spatial inequalities and those socioeconomic disparities you see in lots of South African cities.
Makes you realize that urbanization isn't just buildings and roads and all that. It's about people, and how they're treated. But even setting aside the legacy of apartheid, I'm guessing that fast urbanization brings its own challenges, right?
Absolutely. Think about it. When a city's population explodes, it needs to provide houses, schools, hospitals, transportation, all those services for all those people fast. It's huge, and even with the best plans, it's really hard to stay ahead of it.
I actually saw some examples of that in the notes, things like overcrowded schools, long waits at clinics, traffic jams. Sounds like the city is bursting at the seams. And that's where things like urban planning, sustainable development, making sure everyone can get what they need, it all becomes really, really important.
It's not enough to just keep up with the growth. It's about making sure it helps everybody.
Exactly. And that brings up a crucial point. We've talked a lot about the challenges here, but it's so important to remember cities are amazing places. They're hubs of innovation, creativity, people coming together from all over. They can be places of incredible opportunity, diversity, and progress.
So where do we go from here? We've got all this info, all these complex issues. What do we do with it all?
The million-dollar question. But the good news is you've already begun that journey just by taking a look at your notes. You've seen the problems, you've seen the potential. Now it's about making those connections.
It's like we've given you all the puzzle pieces, and now you get to put them together.
Exactly. What kind of future do you want to see in cities? Not just in Africa, but everywhere. How can we use what we know about the past, deal with the present, and create cities that are fairer, sustainable, those vibrant places, for future generations? Something to think about.
It really is. Wow, this deep dive has been quite a trip. We started with something simple, settlements, and ended up talking about these massive challenges and opportunities that affect all of us.
It just shows you. Sometimes the most important stuff hides in plain sight.
And that's a wrap on another deep dive. Keep exploring, keep those questions coming, and most importantly, never stop learning. Catch you next